My name is Julia Carter. I'm a district judge. Once called a disgrace by my own family, once publicly humiliated by my brother right before Christmas dinner. They thought I would disappear forever. But then, at my brother's wedding rehearsal, his fiancée bowed her head before me and said two words, "Your Honor." The entire garden went silent. Every eye turned to me, and my brother froze, pale as paper. Have you ever been denied by your own family just because you didn't follow the life they mapped out for you? If you have, you're not alone. Let me tell you the story I've lived through. The story of a letter never sent to me, but written for me. A letter that shook the foundation of my entire family. If you've ever had to fight to be yourself, then walk this path with me. Follow this channel so you won't miss what happens next. My story begins in the very place they said I no longer belonged. I still remember the night I was cut out of my family like a wound too cold to heal. It was Christmas night, 5 years ago. The Carter estate glowed in golden light, filled with the clink of glasses, bursts of laughter, and the aroma of roast chicken and red wine. Everyone was dressed to perfection, talking, smiling, and I was seated quietly at the far end of the table, facing the empty chair where my grandfather once sat, the only person in the family who ever said I mattered, even when I chose a different path. I remember the forest green wool dress I wore that night, the one Mom bought me the year before as a small token of care. I brought a homemade dessert, placed it on the table, and no one paid it any attention. There were caterers now, personal chefs, and I was still trying to find my place, if not in their hearts, at least in the room. One by one, my relatives stood to make toasts, celebrating their successes that year. My uncle talked about opening another clinic. My mother proudly shared a magazine cover featuring my brother's photo. Then Brandon stood up, dark gray suit, expensive watch peeking from his cuff, that chilling, calculated confidence on his face. He raised his glass, scanned the table, and landed his gaze on me. "I just want to say," he began, in that low, steady voice, "everyone in this family has worked hard to uphold the Carter name. Everyone, except for those who chose their own path." The room fell silent. I could hear the faint clink of cutlery settling on porcelain. Brandon smiled, emptied his wine, and leaned in just slightly. "Some chose law over healing. Some think justice lives in paperwork and courtrooms, not in operating rooms. It's a shame." My cheeks burned like a thin layer of flame had brushed across my skin. I looked to my mother, her head lowered. My father sat motionless, unaffected. A few relatives looked at me with pity, others with smug amusement. I just wanted to leave. I laid my napkin down, steadied my hands, and stood. Walked out of the room in silence. No one called after me, not a word from my parents, not even a glance from my brother. That night, I drove back to my cramped apartment on the east side of the city. Snow fell gently, blanketing the car roof. Thin streaks of white slid down the windshield. Brandon's laughter and the sound of clinking glasses echoed in my head. I opened the door to my tiny place. No Christmas tree, no gingerbread cookies, just a thin mattress on the floor beside a cluttered desk. I sat on the cold tile, pulled off my shoes, and cried into my knees like a child. Yes, I had quit medical school, but not because I was weak. I left because I couldn't stay in a place where ethics were optional, where truth was bent to preserve the so-called prestige of the hospital. In my second year, I witnessed a post-op infection caused by medical error. But my father, respected professor, admired father figure, told the surgeon to falsify the records. I had asked him naively, "Is that right?" He glanced at me and said, "The Carter name matters more than the truth." That day, something inside me cracked. I started spending time in the law library. I studied patients' rights, legal protections for the vulnerable. I came alive. I withdrew from med school, applied to law school, and started from scratch. My father said nothing. My mother cried, but didn't stop me. Brandon smirked and called me a disgrace to the Carter legacy. From that day on, all financial support vanished. I washed dishes in restaurants, worked at a bookstore, slept on friends' sofas, lived on instant noodles and clearance bread. I studied through pain, through anger buried deep every time Brandon's face showed up on some article praising him as the ideal heir to the Carter family. I didn't go home for the holidays. I deleted my parents from my contacts. I funded every credit, survived every exam, clinging to one belief that someday I would stand where they could no longer ignore me. My grandfather was the only one who called. Once he sent me a small package, a handwritten note that read, "You don't need to honor a name, just live with your head held high. The Carter name isn't worth more than who you are." Tucked inside was a photo of us when I was little, holding hands on the backyard grass. I stuck it on my fridge door in that little kitchen and looked at it every morning like a quiet vow. I thought time would soften the pain, but 5 years later it still lay in wait, flaring back with a glance, a word, a memory. When I got the wedding invitation from Brandon, not from him or our parents, but secretly from my mother, I almost threw it out. But I didn't. I held it in my hands, read her handwriting. "Julia, I miss you. They don't know I'm sending this. Please come." I didn't know what changed her heart. I didn't know why my hands didn't shake when I typed my reply. "I'll be there." Maybe I wasn't going to forgive. Maybe I wasn't going to retaliate either. I just wanted them to look at me one more time, but as the woman they tried to erase. A woman who survived being cast out by her own blood. I couldn't sleep that night after sending my reply. Her words echoed in my mind like a sad melody on loop. "I miss you. They don't know I'm sending this." Just one simple line, but I could feel every crack behind it, the cracks of a woman who once chose silence and was now struggling to call her daughter back. But that longing wasn't enough to erase what I remembered. I remembered every cold night in that broken down room, wearing 2 sweaters just to stay warm. I remembered meals of peanut butter on toast and walking over an hour home after my shift because I couldn't afford gas. Meanwhile, Brandon lived in luxury apartments, tuition covered, climbing the ladder with family money, while I scraped together every dollar from scholarships and part-time jobs. I remembered standing in a law school lecture hall wearing a thrifted suit, feeling like a fraud among kids with legacy surnames and family connections. I remembered the skeptical looks when I first walked into court as a trainee, how a young woman without pedigree had to fight for space no one wanted to give her. I remembered being mistaken for the assistant, the stenographer, the intern, everything except who I truly was. Each time, I just smiled faintly, opened my case file, and proved myself the only way I knew how, with competence. No one in my family knew I had earned the state's Outstanding Young Attorney Award. No one came to my graduation when I gave the commencement speech. No one texted when I was appointed district judge at 33, the youngest in regional history. I remember the night I got that appointment. I sat alone in my grandfather's house, holding a cheap glass of red wine. No one celebrated with me, only the photo of us on the wall where he stood behind me, beaming. A night that should have felt like a pinnacle, felt instead like an echo in the dark. That old house was all I had left of childhood, a craftsman-style place on the edge of town, red shingled roof, a backyard full of oak trees where Grandpa once taught me to tie a tie. He was the only one who never asked me to become what they had drawn up. When I dropped out of med school, he called just to say, "I'm proud of you. Do whatever you love, as long as you don't lose yourself." I couldn't respond. I just cried. Throughout my years in law school and practicing as an attorney, I kept writing in a journal. But instead of leaving it by my bedside like I used to, I hid it inside an encrypted folder on my laptop, buried between legal case files and trial briefs. I wrote in my own voice, not trying to sound strong. I wrote about the nights I couldn't cry out loud because the walls were too thin, about the fear of being excluded from the professional community, not because I wasn't good enough, but because I was a white woman from a wealthy family who had been cast out by that very family. I wrote about the people I helped, a single mother who won back custody from her abusive ex, an elderly man who kept his home after almost being tricked into signing a fraudulent mortgage. Each victory wasn't just a line on my resume, it was a brick I laid to rebuild my life, piece by piece. And when I was nominated to become a judge, I thought, maybe now they'll notice. Maybe Mom would call or Brandon would send a short message. But no, silence, as if I'd never existed in the Carter family. I didn't send them invitations to my swearing-in ceremony. I didn't want my father sitting in the front row like he had at Brandon's medical school graduation, only to sit in silence while his daughter took on one of the highest responsibilities in public service. I didn't want Brandon offering polite smiles and shallow questions, pretending we were distant cousins. I thought I was used to the severing. But then I saw my mother's handwriting on Brandon's wedding invitation and my chest tightened. Not from emotion, but because I no longer understood what I felt. I was just tired. I wasn't coming to make a scene. I wasn't going to yell at anyone, but I also wasn't coming to bow my head and pretend. I was going to walk into the place I'd once been cast out from, not with pride, but with quiet strength. They wouldn't recognize me. Not because I was different, but because I had become someone they never cared to understand. And I wouldn't walk away quietly. I would stay. I would stand there so they couldn't look away. 2 days before the wedding, my mother called me. I saw the name on my screen, Evelyn Carter, a name that once made me feel small, now made my chest ache. I let the call ring until the last second before I answered, steadying my voice. "You're coming, aren't you?" she asked. No small talk, no softening. "Is my name even on the guest list?" I replied, voice dry. "I haven't added it, but I've set a place for you." "They don't know you got the invitation." They. She went silent for a long moment. "Your father, Brandon. They both assume you threw it away." I didn't respond. "I want you to come, Julia. Not for the wedding, for me. I want to see you." I heard her sigh through the phone. I couldn't tell if it was from exhaustion or guilt. "I still have something that belonged to your grandfather," she added, her voice trembling slightly. "Something that never should have been in Brandon's hands." I sat up straighter. "What is it?" "Something your grandfather meant to give you before he passed. But you disappeared. I didn't know what else to do except let Brandon keep it. That was my mistake." I didn't say anything, my hand clenched, fingernails pressing into my palm. I didn't know what she was referring to, but the fact that she'd held onto it all these years made the distance between us feel even heavier. "I want to see you, just the two of us, before the rehearsal dinner, at your grandfather's old house. Tomorrow afternoon, can you come?" I ended the call without answering, but the next day I went. The wooden house sat on a quiet street on the west side of the city. I had lived there for a few years after Grandpa passed. I still paid the taxes, still raked the leaves every fall, but I hadn't stepped into that living room, the one where he used to read the paper with his feet propped on the old coffee table, for a long time. My mother was waiting on the porch, wearing the same gray wool coat I remembered hanging in her closet back in high school. As I stepped up the porch stairs, she said softly, "Thank you for coming." I nodded. She led me inside without another word. The living room was nearly untouched. Grandpa's armchair, the wall-mount pendulum clock, and the dark wood bookshelf still smelling faintly of old pages. I sat on the couch, hands resting on my knees like I was about to be judged. She sat across from me, opened a small bag, and pulled out a square wooden box. She slid it toward me. I opened it. Inside was a gold pocket watch, engraved with the initials W.C., William Carter, my grandfather. I recognized it immediately. He wore it every Sunday when we went to church, then sat with me by the little backyard pond, telling me stories about just courtrooms he'd witnessed back when he practiced. He said he'd pass it on to whoever he believed would carry the family's spirit, my mother said softly. Not the medical legacy, but the integrity. I looked up at her. "Why didn't you give it to me sooner?" "Because I was a coward," she said. "No excuses, no softening. Because I was scared. Scared to go against your father, scared of hurting Brandon, scared of facing the truth that..." I let you walk alone for too long. I placed my hand over the watch, feeling the cold metal and its familiar weight. A memory surfaced. Grandpa once placed it in my tiny palm and said, "Justice isn't about shouting. It's knowing when to be silent and when you can't afford to be." "I saw you on TV," my mother said, voice barely above a whisper. "When you took your oath, when you ruled on the West Side case, when you stood there, no one beside you, yet so proud it looked like the entire courthouse was yours." I looked down at my shoes. Part of me wanted to forgive her, another part wanted to scream that it was too late. "You're angry with me," she whispered. "Yes," I said without hesitation, "but not for your silence. I'm angry because you knew everything, and still let them turn me into a shadow in my own family." She lowered her head, tears falling silently. "I'm not going to the wedding to cause trouble," I continued, my voice steadier than I expected. "But I won't pretend to be their little girl anymore. I'm the person Grandpa believed in. I'm Julia Carter, and they're going to have to face that." I closed the watch box and slipped it into my pocket. "I'll go," I said, "and if they have something to say, they'll have to say it to my face." My mother nodded, her eyes red. I stood, stepped out of the house that held too many memories, and didn't look back. The evening breeze rustled the old oak trees. A single dry leaf drifted onto the stone path. I walked over it without pausing. They once let me walk out in silence. I would walk in, and they would hear every step. I arrived at the wedding rehearsal early, well before the scheduled time, because I didn't want to walk in while everyone was busy toasting Brandon's name. I drove my old sedan through the wrought iron gates of Rosewood Estate, the most expensive development in the city, where my parents once brought us to mingle with high society doctors and their families. I remembered sitting in the passenger seat of my father's car, looking out the window, listening to him talk about respectable families with heritage and tradition. I never knew if he realized that with every word he said, I grew quieter, as if he didn't see there was no room for me in that vision of family, not the way I truly was. Now I was driving through those gates again, alone without needing anyone by my side to justify my presence. The garden was decorated with white floral garlands draped along the stone paths. Beneath the flower arch, a few servers were adjusting the lighting, setting out glasses. I saw my mother speaking with someone near the reception area. She turned just as my heels clicked against the stone. She quickly walked over and gently squeezed my hand. A quiet gesture in place of a greeting. "You came," she whispered. "I said I would." She looked around, lowering her voice. "Your father's still inside, and Brandon's at the far end of the garden with the decorators. Claire should be arriving soon." I nodded. Nothing else needed to be said. I wasn't here to ask permission. I was here because I chose to be. I wore a forest green dress that Maya, my best friend and part-time therapist, had picked out for me. "Not too soft, not too flashy. This shade will make them look at you twice," she'd said, as she tugged me out of the tailor shop the day before. I stood tall, the modest heels anchoring each step with control. No one was going to knock me off balance like they did the night I walked out of that Christmas dinner. I was about to head toward the main area when I heard quick footsteps on the stone path. A blonde woman in a simple white dress walked briskly toward me. I recognized her from bar meetings and courtroom hearings. Claire Bennett, Brandon's fiancée. She'd once stood before me in court with such a well-prepared argument that I had nodded in acknowledgement after her closing statement. She stopped right in front of me, her eyes wide with surprise mixed with delight. "Your Honor," she said, dipping her head respectfully. "I didn't expect to see Judge Marshall here." I heard it clearly the moment the breeze stopped after she spoke. Around us, glass clinks softened, footsteps paused. All eyes turned toward the two women, one judge, one bride, standing face to face in a setting no one could have predicted. I looked at her, feeling my hand tighten around the fabric of my dress. "I don't usually find myself invited to weddings," I replied, holding her gaze. She smiled gently, unaware of the storm beginning to build beneath the surface. "Brandon will be surprised," she said. "He really admires you, you know? We've talked a lot about your case law, especially your decision on the Westridge housing case. I still have the printed opinion." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing I wasn't smiling. I wasn't nodding. I wasn't saying anything. Behind Claire, Brandon had just turned from the far end of the garden. He was speaking with someone, but when he saw me, his posture froze like he'd hit a wall. He still held a stack of papers, but his eyes no longer focused on his conversation. They locked onto me. I saw the shift in his face, surprise, confusion, then tension. Claire turned. "Brandon," she called. "You didn't tell me your sister is Judge Eleanor Marshall." No one answered. I took a step forward. "Not quite Eleanor, it's Julia Carter." The air thickened. My mother stepped up beside me, her hand resting gently on my arm. "Daughter of Evelyn and Ronald Carter, and sister of the groom." Claire turned fully to Brandon, her eyes wide in disbelief. "You told me. Your sister dropped out of med school, couldn't handle the pressure, and disappeared. That no one knew where she went," she said, each word landing like a knock on stone. I said nothing. I stood still, letting the truth speak for itself. Claire looked at me, then back at Brandon. "You told me. She was disowned because she was weak." I took a deep breath. "Wasn't wrong about being disowned," I said. Not bitterly, just as someone recounting a place they were no longer welcome. "But I didn't disappear. I walked away from where I wasn't heard. And I walked far enough to find my own voice." Brennan stepped forward, his face pale. "You shouldn't have come." I met his eyes. "And you shouldn't build a marriage on a lie." Before I could turn, a sharp sound cut through the silence of the garden. A glass shattered, followed by someone shouting from the hallway leading into the main house. Everyone turned toward the noise. A man rushed over, out of breath, gripping the doorframe. "Mr. Carter, it's Mr. Carter. He just collapsed in the library. We've called for an ambulance." I turned sharply. My mother went pale, nodded quickly, and followed the man. Brandon dropped the stack of papers onto the floral table and sprinted into the house, leaving Claire standing, frozen. I moved fast behind them, my heels clicking against the stone path in sync with my shallow breath. Inside the Rosewood Estate's main house, the atmosphere was chaos. Servers stepped aside. A few doctor guests followed close behind Brandon. My father sat slumped in an armchair in the library, his face colorless, one hand clutched to his chest, eyes shut. Light from the tall window caught the beads of sweat on his forehead. A young doctor I recognized as Brandon's colleague was checking his blood pressure, hands slightly trembling. "Irregular heartbeat, possibly mild cardiac ischemia. We've called the ambulance." Brandon knelt beside our father, movement steady, voice hoarse but controlled. "Dad, can you hear me? Look at me." My father's eyes opened a sliver. He saw Brandon, tried to form words. Then his gaze shifted to me. Just for a second. But it was there. A look I had never seen from him before. Not judgment, not expectation, but acknowledgement. Fragile and faint. "Julia," he called, voice so faint I had to lean close to hear. I hesitated, then stepped forward. He lifted his hand, once steady with a stethoscope, once firm, signing hospital documents, once cold, holding his morning coffee without looking at me, now trembling as he reached for mine. I took his hand. "Dad, not much time," he whispered. If there's ever a chance you could forgive." I didn't respond. I just held his hand tighter. The tightness in my chest wasn't from anger. It was from the shattering weight of what should have come long ago. He squeezed my hand gently. "William, your grandfather, he was right. You're not a shadow in this family. You're the only one who held on to what honor really means." I heard the distant wail of an ambulance. Brandon stood, signaling the paramedics as they arrived. Everything moved fast. Within a minute, my father was on a stretcher, wired to monitors and an oxygen mask. As the EMTs rolled the stretcher past me, he turned his head. His lips moved. No sound came out, but I understood. I didn't need him to say it. I walked out to the front lawn, standing beside Brandon as the ambulance revved and pulled away. My mother sat inside, holding my father's wrist the entire time. They disappeared around the bend at the end of the estate's driveway. Brandon didn't speak. He stood still, hands on his hips, eyes fixed on the road, his face pale, stripped of the cocky confidence he used to wear like armor. "I know you hate me," he said without turning, "but I didn't think today would turn out like this." I crossed my arms. I didn't come here to bring anyone down. Dad didn't collapse because of me. It was because of all the years he chose to stay silent. Brandon looked up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. I lied to Claire. I lied to myself. I've built my entire life on a foundation I don't even believe in anymore. But you never fell. I didn't respond. I didn't need to confirm that. Hmm? He said your name. He hasn't done that in years. When he looked at you, it wasn't like someone looking at a traitor. I turned toward him. No, he looked at me like the only person left who stayed loyal to themselves. He lowered his head. Claire won't forgive me? I glanced toward the garden where she still stood, her white dress stark against the gray sky. She hadn't moved closer. She hadn't walked away. She just stood there, arms folded across her chest, eyes fixed on the library. What happens between you and Claire is between the two of you, I said slowly. I have no part in it. But if you really want to keep her, start by not running anymore. Brandon nodded. I had never seen him this quiet. The man who used to speak endlessly at family gatherings couldn't even form a full sentence now. Finally, he looked straight at me, for the first time without any guard in his eyes. Would you ride with Mom? I need a few hours here to straighten things out. I nodded. Then I quietly stepped inside, grabbed my coat, took the old pocket watch from my bag, and held it in my hand like a piece of evidence between all the words never spoken. I knew every word I had waited to hear from my father may have come too late, but at least I heard them, while he was still lucid enough to know I had forgiven him, even if I never said it out loud. I arrived at Memorial Hospital after dark. The hallway lights cast a pale yellow glow onto the white tile floor, making the whole place feel oddly cold. My mother sat on a long bench near the ICU, her coat still dusted with bits of grass, silver hair falling softly around her bare face. I sat down beside her in silence. The doctor said your father is stable, she said softly, both hands wrapped tightly around a now cold paper cup of coffee. But his lifestyle will have to change. They're not sure how well he'll recover if he keeps living the way he has. I nodded. I didn't ask any questions or offer advice. At that moment, I wasn't a judge. I wasn't the daughter cut out of family portraits. I was just someone who'd sat alone in hallways like this too many times, with no one ever waiting with me. She looked at me, eyes wet. Julia, I'm sorry. For all the years I stayed silent. I left you to fight alone against a kind of pain that I should have shielded you from. I turned my face away, not out of anger, but because I couldn't bear that look in her eyes. I had waited over a decade to hear that apology, and now that it came, I didn't feel satisfied. I just felt tired. I know you don't need to hear it, she continued, her voice shaky. But I needed to say it. I've followed everything you've done. Every article, every news piece, every time your name came up. I kept it all in a box in my study, where your father never looked. You thought I didn't care, but I remembered every date you graduated, every award you received. I turned back toward her. Then why didn't you call? Send a message, a card? I was afraid, she whispered. Afraid that if I reached out, you'd turn me away, that you'd tell me I was just a stranger, and most of all, I didn't know where to start. I exhaled slowly. Every word of blame inside me had dried up long ago. I didn't feel angry at her anymore, only sorrow, for all the years we could have had together, lost in the silence. A nurse stepped out and called for my father. My mother gently squeezed my hand. Will you come with me? I nodded. The ICU room was spacious, filled with the scent of antiseptic and fresh linens. My father lay in the hospital bed, IV line in his arm, heart monitor pulsing in steady rhythm. When I stepped in, he opened his eyes, looking at me for a long moment without saying a word. I couldn't tell if it was guilt, gratitude, or just fatigue. All I knew was that I didn't look away. My mother sat beside him, whispering something I couldn't catch. He nodded faintly. Then he turned to me. "Julia, thank you for coming." I gripped the strap of my purse. "You don't need to thank me. I came for Mom." He nodded, as if accepting that. "You still have the watch?" he asked. I pulled it from my coat pocket and placed it on the table beside his bed. Ever kept it. For Grandpa, not for this family. He closed his eyes, exhaled softly. Then he was right, leaving it to you. No one said anything else. The heart monitor beeped in steady rhythm like a ticking clock. I thought about all the times I'd imagined walking into a room like this, filled with everything I wanted to scream in my father's face. But when the moment actually came, I didn't want to hurt him, because I no longer needed that to know how strong I really was. An hour later, I left the hospital, letting Mom stay behind. As I stepped into the lobby, I saw Claire sitting on a bench, hands clutching her purse. She stood up quickly when she saw me. "Him sure didn't come with you?" she asked. "No," I said. "He needs time. And probably distance." Claire nodded, her eyes red but steady. "Last night, after everyone left, he came to see me. He told me everything. The lies he told, why he never mentioned you, about your grandfather, your parents." I waited for her to continue. I asked him, if today hadn't happened, would he have ever told me the truth? He didn't answer. And that was all I needed to know. I was about to speak, but she went on. "I'm not postponing the wedding because of you. I'm postponing it because I realized I fell in love with someone who hasn't yet been honest with himself." I looked at her, no longer surprised or tense, just quietly respectful. "Claire," I said, "thank you for calling me Your Honor before you knew who I was." She smiled softly. "I said it out of respect, not for your title, but for what you've done. For people like me, who once had no one to believe in them." I stood there a moment, then extended my hand. Claire took it firmly. "You'll be okay," I said, "whether the wedding happens or not. You don't need them to prove your worth." She nodded, this time with no tears, and I walked out of the hospital, carrying an old pocket watch and a promise that if any of us had held onto anything from the past, it was the ability to stand tall, not because we were lifted, but because we had once been knocked down. 1 year after the wedding was postponed, I stood in my new office, looking out the large window toward the city square. Below me were the bustling crowds, the same streets I used to walk after long court days. The room was quiet, with only the soft rustle of paper and the steady ticking of the wall clock. I had been appointed to the state appellate court that spring, after a long and rigorous vetting process. No one in my family ever mentioned seeing my name on the short list. I didn't tell them either. Everything unfolded the way my life always had, quietly, but with conviction. When I stepped onto the state court's oath platform, the people standing behind me weren't my parents or Brandon. They were colleagues, community attorneys, victims I had once defended, and a few law students I had mentored. Some of them cried. I didn't. I saw Claire in the back row, her hair neatly tied, her face calm. She didn't come with Brandon. She didn't need to. 6 months after the wedding was called off, Claire left her old firm and founded Wilson Legal Services, a community law organization. I knew the first grant had come from my mother. She never said it out loud, but I saw my name in the quarterly report from the charity fund my mother quietly rebuilt after our family's breakdown. We were no longer two women tied to the same man. We were colleagues, sometimes friends, always people who understood how fragile justice could be, because we'd both walked through truths wrapped in silence. I remember clearly my first hearing at the new court, a land dispute between a Latino community and a massive real estate corporation. Claire appeared with a team of young lawyers, case files in hand, eyes sharp. When it was her turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice clear. We ask the court to reevaluate how the Minority Neighborhood Protection Clause, established over 40 years ago, is being applied. I looked at her, not with favoritism, but with the objective gaze I gave every case, and she knew it. During the break, Claire approached me with a file excerpt. "Thank you," she said quietly. Not for the hearing, but for being the reason I realized I didn't need a wedding dress to be accepted by someone's family. I didn't respond. I just looked at her, feeling something mend. Not kinship, but a shared belief that truth could be rebuilt with action. A few months later, I returned to my parents' old house, not because Dad called, but because Mom wanted to host a small family dinner, with the condition no fancy guests, no speeches, and no pressure to perform. She wanted me to sit and have dinner with them. As a daughter, I went, not out of formality, but because I needed to know if things could ever feel normal again. The Hilltop mansion looked the same, but it no longer felt cold. The grand oil portraits had been replaced with more natural family photos. In the hallway hung my grandfather's old diploma, next to my parents' wedding photo and a picture of young Brandon. What made me pause longest was a new photo on the shelf. Me, at my swearing-in ceremony, hand raised in legal oath, face solemn but eyes bright. Mom stepped out from the kitchen, drying a plate. "Your dad wanted that one up," she said. "He said not to remember what we lost, but to remember what we still have." I didn't ask much. I sat down at the dinner table where only 3 people sat, me, Mom, and Dad. Brandon wasn't there. After the canceled wedding, he'd taken an unpaid 6-month leave and joined a volunteer medical program in underserved regions. I hadn't reached out to him, but Mom sent me a local news article about a young doctor from New York performing surgeries with makeshift equipment in a tent-built OR. My dad asked me about work like a colleague asking an acquaintance. No more interrogation, no comparisons, just constructive questions. The same kind he used to ask Brandon when they were close. I realized he didn't need me to be like him in order to listen. That night, as I left the house, Mom handed me a small paper bundle. "You should have this. It's the last thing your grandfather wrote before he passed. I found it in his desk drawer. No one else knew it was there." I took it, but didn't open it immediately. I just held it close, like holding a part of myself that had once been severed from its roots. On the drive home, I stopped by the small cemetery on the south side of the city where my grandfather rested. I sat by his grave, unfolded the paper, and read the slanted lines he'd written in blue ink. "Julia, if you're reading this, maybe you've forgiven, even a little, those who never truly saw you. But you don't owe them that. You only need to keep living the way you chose. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove that I was right." I folded the letter back, my hands trembling with nameless emotion. Night had fallen and the headlights from passing cars cast soft glows on the gravel walkway. I didn't cry. I no longer needed to. I'd lived long enough to understand that some acknowledgments don't come from others' mouths, but from the choices you never turned your back on, even after years of being called a disappointment. About a month after that family dinner, Mom invited me over again, this time to her house. Not the mansion on the hill, but a smaller place she'd moved into after Dad retired and Brandon officially moved out. The home sat in a quiet neighborhood on the city's south side, with a little backyard where she planted herbs and lavender herself. I sat in the kitchen, filled with the smell of fresh baked apple pie, warm afternoon light filtering through the window by the sink. The dinner table had only 3 of us, Mom, Dad, and me. No embroidered family name tablecloth, no fine china, just white ceramic bowls rimmed in blue and old glass cups Mom had saved since I was a kid. No one mentioned the hospital, the canceled wedding, or the years of silence between me and Dad, but something had shifted. I felt it when he asked about a lawsuit involving medical ethics at the hospital where he once worked, not to debate or lecture, but to hear my legal view. I didn't even realize I was answering naturally until he nodded and reached for his notepad, as if he'd just learned something new. After dinner, Mom pulled me into her small study, once a reading room she'd remodeled, now covered in watercolor paintings she made herself. She opened a drawer and took out a neatly clipped folder. I opened it and saw my name appear in almost every article, every legal citation from the past 10 years. "You've been tracking all of this?" I asked, genuinely surprised. She smiled. "Since the beginning. I just didn't know how to show you without hurting you more." I flipped through the pages, even found a printed copy of my speech from the Boston Family Law Reform Summit, an event I thought no one familiar had attended. She'd highlighted lines in pale yellow, her handwriting still soft like the letters she used to write when I was little, the ones she never sent. I rested my hand on the stack of papers. Why keep it all hidden? I thought you needed to walk alone, and I needed time to relearn how to be your mother. I said nothing. I thought of all the nights I stayed up preparing briefs, the moments I won a case and stepped out of court alone, and the times I tied my wrist just to stop myself from dialing home. We all had a part in the distance that stretched too long. But now, I didn't want to place blame. I just wanted to know if anything could still be rebuilt from old bricks. Before I left, Mom held my hand and hesitated. "I've been invited to join the board of the Community Legal Support Fund," she said softly, as if unsure I'd believe her. "Claire nominated me. They need a representative for the community, a parent's voice, and I think I'm finally ready to do something that matters." I looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes no longer held the fear or hesitation of the past, just the resolve of a woman who had once been wrong, but now lived each day trying to make it right. I nodded. "You'll be good," I said. "You don't have to be my mom for me to believe that. Just be you." That night, when I got home, I found a large envelope on my kitchen table. Inside was a draft speech from the governor's office. They wanted me to speak at the 10-year anniversary of the Juvenile Justice Reform Program, the one I had proposed and helped write. I sat down, the draft in hand, but my mind drifted from the bureaucratic lines. I thought of what my father said at the hospital. "You're not a shadow in this family." That line echoed in my mind, not as praise, but as a door that had once been slammed shut, now gently opening. I thought about Brandon. He still hadn't returned to the States after 6 months. Mom said he kept writing letters regularly, sending photos from rural villages where he performed emergency surgeries by kerosene lamp and with old bandages. In one letter to her, he wrote, "I'm not sure I'll go back to being a surgeon in New York. I want to study community healthcare models. I think Julia would understand." He didn't mention me dropping out of med school. He said I might understand. Maybe that was the first step towards something else. I wasn't hoping he'd come back to apologize. I just hoped that if he did come back, he wouldn't be the kind of man who needed to stand on me to feel taller. I folded the draft speech, placed it on the table, then stepped out onto the balcony. The night sky had no moon, just a few faint stars flickering above. I sat in the wooden chair, reaching for the pocket watch still tucked into my coat. The hands had stopped moving, but I never fixed it. I kept it just as it was. Like Grandpa once wrote, "Sometimes time isn't measured in minutes, but in what we choose to hold on to, and what we choose never to repeat." On Saturday morning, I returned to the cemetery on the south side of the city, where my grandfather rested under an old oak tree. In my hands was a thin stack of documents, my latest ruling. It was a case between a group of working-class parents and the school board, in which I ordered public schools to provide free mental health support for students whose parents had lost jobs after the pandemic. The decision didn't make headlines, didn't lead the news cycle, but to me, it was one of the most deeply human rulings I'd ever given. I placed the documents on his headstone, brushing them gently, as if handing something directly to him, something I knew, if he were still alive, he'd be proud of. "I didn't choose your path," I whispered, "but I kept what you believed in, that justice isn't found in grand courtrooms, but in the things we dare to do when no one's watching. I sat there for a long time, listening to the wind whisper through the branches, dry leaves falling and making that familiar sound I used to hear during those afternoons when Grandpa and I sat on the porch and he'd tell me, "Fairness isn't always about equality, it's about understanding." My phone buzzed gently in my coat pocket. I glanced at the screen. It was Brandon. I didn't answer right away. I let it ring a few more times, then picked up. "I'm here," I said. "How are you?" His voice was low and tired, but something in it had changed. A long silence passed before he continued. "Are you free? I'm back." I squinted toward the fields in the distance. "Back for good?" "I don't know yet," he said. "I just know I don't want to keep pretending anymore." We agreed to meet at a small cafe near Central Park, the same one Mom used to take us to when we were kids. I arrived early. Brandon was late, as always. But this time, he showed up with a faded backpack slung over his shoulder, no longer the polished man in a suit seated at the head table like in the old days. We sat across from each other, 2 steaming mugs of coffee between us. Neither of us touched them. "You're still wearing Grandpa's watch," he said softly. "Since the day he passed. I know it was meant to be yours. I kept it the wrong way." I didn't respond. He looked at me, eyes tired like someone worn out by a journey not measured in miles. "I want to tell you something," he said. "At a clinic in Haiti, a 10-year-old boy came in after a car accident. He had lost too much blood. I had to decide, operate immediately in poor conditions or wait for the helicopter. I chose to operate. And he lived." I nodded. "That's what a doctor does." "Not just a doctor," he said, his voice breaking. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about reputation, about my record, about who'd notice. I just thought, if I didn't do something, that kid wouldn't get another chance. And in that moment, I understood why you walked away from the operating room. I looked at him for a long time. In his eyes, there was no smugness like at our old family dinners, just honesty and maybe regret. "I lost Claire," he said. "She told me I needed to be honest with myself before I could be with anyone else. And she was right. But I don't want to lose you too." My hands tightened around my coffee mug. It was still warm. "We lost years of our lives to silence," I said slowly. "Not because of one decision, but because we let silence take the place of real conversation. Do you know I waited for you to ask me just one kind question?" "I know," he admitted, "but when I still had the chance, I stayed quiet." I exhaled deeply, watching an elderly couple pushing a stroller across the park in the distance. "We're not Grandpa's grandkids anymore," I said. "You don't have to apologize to be my brother again. You just have to be willing to show up." Brandon nodded, his eyes slightly red. "If you're okay with it, I'd like to keep in touch. Maybe start with 1 coffee a month." I didn't respond right away, but I knew if there's anything worth trying again, it's the blood ties that were severed by pride, by expectations, by what people thought was love. I nodded slightly. "Next month, same time, right here." He smiled. Not wide, not easy, but real. When we parted ways, he stood up first, but didn't rush. Before leaving, he turned back and looked at me one more time. His eyes no longer carried competition, just something simple, a desire to stay. Not as the heir to the Carter name, but just as Brandon, a man learning how to be a brother again. I don't know what you think about everything my family's been through, but if you've ever been misunderstood, ever been pushed out of your own family's circle just because you didn't live up to their expectations, then maybe you understand me more than anyone else. Do you think Brandon has truly changed? Do you think forgiveness should be offered to those who've let you suffer in silence for so long? I want to hear what you think. Leave a comment, not just to share your view, but to let me know I didn't tell this story alone. And if you care about what comes next, how my mother and I are learning how to be mother and daughter again, how Brandon is working to rebuild trust from the ground up, then don't forget to follow this channel. Life doesn't end when the old doors close. Sometimes that's when it finally begins.